It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who I believe the last time he spoke for us was a while back. So it's just so fantastic. Am I pronouncing your last name right? Maybe you tell me first. Putthoff. Okay, now I am Putthoff. Okay, that's right. So our speaker today, Dr. Putthoff, has a PhD in Biblical and Ancient Near Eastern Studies from Durham University in England. He's been at OU for 8 years. He is a research associate of the Trinity Center for Biblical Studies at Trinity College Dublin. He's associate faculty here at the Schusterman Center, and we're so pleased that he is. He teaches amazing courses. He's an incredibly popular teacher, as I think is also evidenced by the number of students of his who came to our class, came to hear him speak today. He teaches courses at OU in Biblical Studies, Historical and Cinematic Jesus, Religion and Ecology, Biblical Archaeology, and Paul and Christian Origins. And I know it's my job to track enrollment. His classes do incredibly well, and they're incredibly popular, and how he keeps up with so many students is something that I do not know, and I think we all have to learn from. He's published 2 academic monographs in addition to his amazing teaching, 2 academic monographs, and half a dozen articles and essays in print, including Ontological Aspects of Early Jewish Anthropology that was published with Brill in 2017, and Gods and Humans in the Ancient Near East that came out with Cambridge in 2020. He has 4 public-facing books in print, including I, Monster, a new model for understanding sin, death, and human nature, and which he's going to be talking about today. Another book due August 2026 on Paul and divine embodiment. So he puts us all to shame in terms of his teaching and publishing productivity. And then in addition to everything, he has a wife and 3 teenage kids in Norman, and he's active in basketball. So welcome, Tyson. Thank you so much.
So last time I was here, 2019, a little bit's happened since then. My hair was, if you were here, my hair was probably at my shoulders at that point, and it was still on its way down throughout. That COVID, I got to try some things. And the beard was probably down to here. But, man, it's good to be here. And I'm excited to talk about, so I didn't have slides or anything today, and I hope that's okay. I can pass along. If anybody, my email is tyson@ou.edu. If anybody wants to, write me, criticize me, whatever, come on in. About what I talk about today. But I want to start out with a story. And it's an ancient story. It's as old as civilization itself. It's kind of my version of it, but you may be familiar. In the beginning, any of my Bible students are in here, you need to know that. In the beginning, all right. What translation are we using? Yeah, we'll move on. In the beginning. Before the heavens and the earth were separate things. So this is my version. There were 2 primordial gods, Apsu, the freshwater deep, and Tiamat, the saltwater sea. So it's a little different version, right? Fun fact, fair warning, this version of the creation story ends in cosmic murder and a little bit of violence. In the beginning, before the heavens and the earth were created, the 2 were separate things. There were 2 primordial gods, Apsu, the freshwater deep, and Tiamat, the saltwater sea. They were mingled together, inseparable, 2 divine forces swirling around as one entity in the dark waters of the cosmos. From their union, the younger gods were born, and those younger gods, as younger generations are prone to do, became insufferable to the older gods. I love my kids, but they're teenagers. They became loud, they became restless, they disrupted the primordial peace that Apsu and Tiamat had known since the beginning of time. Apsu, exhausted, decided the only solution was to destroy these younger gods. He hatched a plan by which he'd do away with them. But Ea, the trickster god of wisdom, caught wind of it. Ea killed Apsu before Apsu could act. So Tiamat, now grieving, now furious at the loss of her significant other, raised an army. She gave birth to monsters from her own body, serpents, dragons, hybrid horrors draped in terror. She appointed a champion to fight the battle, a god named Kingu, and she strung the tablet of destinies around his neck and prepared for war. So along comes Marduk, young, ambitious, unproven. When none of the other gods dared to step into battle against the ferocious and terrifying dragon queen of the cosmos, Tiamat, Marduk stepped forth and he made a deal with the gods. Let me face Tiamat, and if I win, I get to rule as king. So they agreed. They didn't have a choice. And the battle was cosmic. It was epic. Marduk spread his net. He drove the winds into Tiamat's open mouth. She couldn't close it. And then he drove his spear through her. And then, and get this, Marduk sliced Tiamat's body in half. And one half became the heavens, the other half became the earth. Her eyes became the Tigris and the Euphrates. Her tail bent up into the sky and became the Milky Way. The mountains emerged from her breasts, and the clouds and rain from her spittle. According to this tale, the world was made out of a defeated monster, a defeated divine creature. The cosmos was constructed from the body of chaos itself. This is the Enuma Elish. A lot of you are familiar with it. If you've been in my classes, you've heard me talk about chaos and dragons and monsters and stuff plenty this semester. It's a great Babylonian epic. But check out what happens next. So Marduk still needed workers, right? Someone to do the labor of the gods on this newly created patch of land. So he turned to Kingu, Tiamat's general, the one who had worn illegitimately the Tablet of Destinies and who was, along with Tiamat, responsible for the rebellion. And Marduk had Kingu executed. But then, and here's the detail. He took Kingu's divine blood, he mixed it with clay, and from this bloody, muddy concoction, Marduk actually fashioned a new type of creature. The creature was, of course, humanity. Us. So according to this tale, we as humans are made from the blood of a rebel deity. Not the luminous, ordered, creative divine, but in the chaotic, the insurgent, the boundary-defying divine. His blood is our blood. His nature is woven into ours. And the ancients who told this story, I don't think we're just looking around being pessimistic. I think they were just being honest. They looked around and they looked at the human condition and they said, something in us is wild, something in us bucks against the order of things, and rather than sort of just ignore it or pretend otherwise or philosophize about it, they traced it all the way back to the beginning. Of course, this is us. Look at what we're made of. A related Mesopotamian account, the Atrahasis myth, presses the point even further, where the Enuma Elish tells us that humanity was made from a rebel god's blood. Atrahasis specifies exactly which part of that god mattered the most. His temu, his mind, his intelligence, his scheming inner self was carried in his ghost, in his etemu, his animating spirit. And when this rebel deity was killed and mixed with the clay, it was that spirit, the spirit that carried his calculating mind, his rebellious thoughts, and it was folded into the human creature like an egg yolk in a batter. The myth it's fascinating. It's full of deliberate wordplay. The rebellious spirit of the rebel monster god becomes the same rebellious spirit of humanity. His intelligence, his schemingness is actually our intelligence and our scheming nature. It's not a copy. It's not something that was implanted as a model of the original. It was the actual thing that was passed down through the very stuff of which we are made. Okay? So humanity's propensity for disorder, in other words, for disobedience, for chaos, it's not this malfunction. It's not a later addition. It's a feature of the original material out of which humanity is made. The rebellious spirit of the slain rogue deity lives inside us, the ancients believed, and it was baked into the clay from the first moment. So that tale, that series of texts, that's where my research into monstrous humanity began. And as it turns out, it's where my life began to intersect with my research in ways that I didn't see coming, to be honest. So 2020, I'm finishing up Gods and Humans to publish with Cambridge, and I'm working on chapter 3. And I'm just rereading things before it goes to final revisions and print. And I was mapping the mixed nature of the human self in Mesopotamian thought. Part clay, part divine blood, part rogue spirit. And I found myself just continuing to have questions I couldn't answer. And obviously, it was too late to put that into the book, right? Publishers don't like that, it turns out. And it wasn't because I was confused. If you've studied ancient texts on any level, right, it's just rich and fascinating. But I was surprised by an implication that was sitting right there in the texts that I really hadn't seen anyone, at least in my fields, name and discuss directly. And the implication is this: that having a share in the divine nature is not automatically a good thing. Okay, so I'll say that again. Having a share in the divine nature is not automatically a good thing. So I want to slow down. When we talk about humans bearing the image of the image of the divine, or participating in the divine nature, or having some share of the sacred within us, the assumption is typically that this is good news about humanity, right? We look around and we see the chaos, and we think, well, that's the good part of human nature. This is what dignifies us. It's what elevates us. Some ancients say that the one who saves a single life saves an entire world, because each person shares in the divine image, in the divine nature on some level. Christian traditions developed theologies of theosis, a deification of humans drawn into participation with the divine life. And these are not trivial. These are really beautiful ideas. And they operate, though, on the assumption that because the divine nature is good, it's ordered, it's orderly, then having a share in the divine nature must also be good and ordered and orderly. But the Mesopotamian creation tales push back against this assumption. And they're saying, yes, you have divine stuff inside of you, but which divine stuff is it? And from which divine entities or beings or creatures or entities? Because the divine in the ancient world, in a lot of cultures, it's not this single, unified, uniformly good force or thing or stuff. The divine in the ancient mind is not only the opposite of chaos, it's actually inclusive of chaos in some accounts. The divine includes rebellion. The divine includes the forces that resist order and push against the limits set for them. So we are hybrid creatures, according to these ancients. That we're part dust, part clay, part divine, to be sure, but the divine in us has a dark edge. And the ancients weren't shy about saying so. So as I'm working on Gods and Humans, in the lead up to 2020, the last time I was here, and in 2020, before it went to print, I put a footnote in chapter 3. It was a little late. They didn't like me changing some things, but they allowed me. Page 65, footnote 83 in Gods and Humans, and it said essentially, I'm going to deal with this idea in a forthcoming volume. And so from here, I started to ask, if this Mesopotamian tradition depicts human nature as having been created from the stuff of the gods, and not the good and the orderly gods, then where else in the biblical world, where else in the Bible, where else in the ancient Near East do we find this idea? And so I started working on the research while I was finishing Gods and Humans. And by the time Gods and Humans went to press, I had a smaller academic volume, needed polished up. It was otherwise complete. So I had that under contract with a publisher, along with a couple of others at the time. And that was the birth of my obsession with monstrous humanity in the Bible and in the ancient Near East. And the further I looked, the more I found monsters are everywhere, right? in the Mesopotamian texts, in the Egyptian text, in the Hittite text, in the Hebrew Bible. You've got Leviathan, we've got Rahab, we've got Behemoth, we've got the seraphim of Isaiah, these six-winged beings surrounding the divine throne. We've got the Ophanim, right? The wheelie guys spinning their wheels, they're covered in eyes, and they're alive with fire. And here's what I noticed, though. Every monster I was finding, and every monster that other scholars working on these same texts were finding, they were all external. Leviathan in the sea, Behemoth in the wilderness, the seraphim at the threshold of the divine throne, they were cosmic forces lurking outside of the human self. In the deep, in the desert, at the edges of creation, places you don't want to go if you don't want to entangle with a monster, right? But the Mesopotamian tradition had pointed towards something interior, right? The monsters that were exterior were also interior, something woven into the material of the human being. And I hadn't found that equivalent outside of this particular set or complex of texts and traditions, at least not yet. So by the time Gods and Humans came out in 2020, I had a lot going for me, to be honest, at least in my world. Multiple book contracts in place, speaking invitations to some cool conferences and places, and my family were thriving. My wife, my kids are doing well. Teaching at OU. Incredible colleagues I can't say enough about. And my students, love y'all, like the best students in the world. In 2020 itself, and I want to be careful about this because I know it was a year of genuine grief and loss for a lot of people. In my little bubble, I'm speaking specifically, the time at home brought some unexpected gifts. New house, new neighborhood. Kids were young enough at that point that they didn't quite understand what was going on. They weren't on social media and on cable news watching what we were seeing, right? They just knew they got to sit at home and spend time with mom and dad and our big old Aussie Pete, Australian Shepherd. Right when the pandemic, the schools closed, everything, the kids, they had sidewalk chalk, and they would actually go around our neighborhood. It was several streets, and they would chalk mailboxes, right? The brick around the mailbox, and they'd decorate them for people, and people liked that because they weren't leaving their houses, and turned into a pretty good deal because some people would come out and pay them like 30, 40, 50 bucks to do this. So it turned into, like, it was a good gig all around for them. I was in the zone. I was writing, I was researching, advising, reading these ancient texts about chaos monsters while the kids were playing, and life was good. At least, like I say, in my little bubble. But then 2021 arrived. And I don't know exactly how to describe what happened, except to say that something hit a wall inside of me. And it wasn't catastrophic, right? Not all at once, more like a sort of this slow just arrival of something I couldn't explain. Anxiety attacks, sort of burdens I couldn't quite name, I couldn't quite put a face to, right? Just this low grade sense that something was going on that I couldn't explain, I couldn't locate through my intellect, right? And I kept teaching, contracts kept moving, I kept doing what I wanted to do and that I was doing, but internally I was wrestling with something I couldn't quite see, and sometimes, studying monsters, you just start to you grasp at pictures to try to explain what's happening. I used to box in my younger days. My wife won't let me sign up anymore. I mean, come on, I'm 46, right? And I've been hit hard in the ring. My very first match, a long time ago, I was nervous. My coaches knew it. Before the bell rang, they said one thing. They said, forget everything you've heard, forget all the coaching, all the training, all the practice. Just remember one thing: get over there first. That's what they told me. They knew the fight or flight or freeze, response typically lands on freeze, and a lot of inexperienced fighters will freeze when the bell rings, and that's not good, right? So I did. I jumped out. I was moving well. First round, second round. I was just cruising along. I was winning and probably getting a little full of myself, a little careless. And I got popped. And my lights went out. And it felt like forever, but it was only about 3 to 4 seconds when I watch it back on video. And sort of my instincts kicked in, and I locked my knees, and I stayed upright, and I tucked into him close, and I came out of it, and then the bell rang, Saved by the Bell. And man, that minute between rounds is the most glorious minute of my life. It's just a sweet relief, right? 2021 just didn't seem like the bell ever rang. It just, no end of the round, no corner, no catching your breath. And 3.5 years in, 21 into 22 into 23 into 24, it just kept going. And during that time, our family experienced some legitimate tragedy. And then on top of that, I got sick, liver failure. Turned out it was mono. When you don't get exposed to mono at a young age, shuts your liver down, does all that. I didn't know that. Put me in bed for all the way through the end of the summer in 2022. Just stuff kept happening. And I had everything to be grateful for, to be honest. Like my colleagues, my students, my family, my friends. So I didn't have any reason. I didn't have anything to point to and to name and any true explanation for this. If I had lost my job, if those book contracts didn't get offered, like if I'd been rejected all over the place, like I would have a face to put with what I was going through, but I didn't. And so I'd leave campus every day in the afternoons. I'd drive home before I went and picked the kids up. My wife works in the city, so she couldn't. So I would drive home, and I would change. I would take off running out the front door. And at 46, or in my early 40s, I probably should have stretched or warmed up or prepped, right? But I didn't, because So it didn't take long before I pulled a hamstring, of course, which hung around for a couple of years. It's probably still there when I think about it. But the pulled hamstring I could understand, right? Yeah, it had a cause, it had a location, it had a name, it had a face. The deeper thing, it didn't have any of that. And so I kept working, I kept teaching, kept reading, kept writing, kept advising. And then something strange happened in the middle of all of this. The research I had been doing, the ancient, historically distant, academically specialized research that just a few people in the world were really interested in, about human nature and divine human nature and monstrous humanity and the chaotic stuff baked into us from the beginning, it stopped being something that I was studying from the outside, and it became personal. And the people who first told the Enuma Elish or the Atrahasis myth around the fires, or passed these stories down to their children, who retold the stories about Leviathan and Rahab and Behemoth and told these stories to try to make sense of the world. They were doing so to try to explain a life in a world that felt dangerous and disordered and not fully tamed. And they weren't, I don't think, making just fun stories up for the sake of fun stories. They were doing what humans have always done when confronted with something we can't explain. They were naming it. They were saying there's something inside of us, there's something outside of us, something that is wild, it refuses to be tamed, and it's been there in their estimation since the beginning. And that's what I was feeling. Like that made sense to me. And not in a clinical sense, though, like the clinical dimensions were real, and I don't want to minimize those, and I'll talk about that. But in a mythic sense is what they were doing. Something inside couldn't be subdued. In my case, I could not think it. I couldn't run away from it. I couldn't reason it away. something the ancient world would have recognized immediately because they had named it, and the name that they had was older than any of our categories. And I realized I got to finish this project. Not because the academic argument is important on its own terms. That was important to me. But because what we do in our world, Judaic studies, biblical studies, religious studies, history, the humanities in general, it carries real stakes for real people. And whether our readers approach these texts as scholars, as practitioners, as people of faith, or whether they're just people trying to make sense of their lives, they rely on what we do. They rely on our findings. And these traditions have resources for naming the unnamed weight, the internal chaos with no obvious cause, that doesn't have a face, that I don't know, at least me, I haven't fully excavated. That's our work, and it matters. And that's when my research and my life collided. And this project that had started to become frustrating really took off. Monster studies and biblical scholarship had been growing for a decade before I came to this project. Scholars were noticing the Bible was genuinely full of creatures that don't fit our categories, right? Leviathan, Rahab, Behemoth, the Seraphim, the Ophanim, creatures with agency in the ancient imagination, but the work in the field is largely descriptive. Here's a list of monsters. Here's what they look like. Here's what they do. Let's move on to the next one. It's almost a cataloging approach. The problem that I continue to find is that nobody had built a framework for what actually makes something monstrous. Criteria you could apply consistently across the texts in my particular world, right? Ancient Near Eastern and biblical. So I built one, 5 traits. I won't walk through all of those now. We can talk about those. But what this framework allowed me to do was to identify what others had been seeing and map them more precisely. But more importantly, it helped me to see monsters that they hadn't seen before. And that was where, again, my research and my life collided. So there's a thread in monster scholarship, it goes back to Freud and his thoughts on the uncanny, or Das Unheimlich, that argues the monster is always, at some level, it's a reflection of the self. Monster externalizes what we can't face internally. It gives shape and location, and it puts a face on what's formless and interior. Frankenstein's monster is not just a creature, for example. He's the creator's ambition, his overreach, his refusal to accept limits. Walking around stitched together in flesh. The xenomorph in Alien gestates inside its host and bursts forth from within. So the horror isn't that like this alien creature is out in the dark stalking you, but that it's inside you. Stephen King's Pennywise, remember reading it in 6th grade with my friend and watching the movie? It's a good idea. Pennywise feeds on fear specifically, right? Becomes whatever you're most afraid of, which means the monster is always a portrait of the person facing it. The monster is out there, yes, in all of these texts and all of these traditions and these tales, but it's also, according to this framework, it's also inside me. It's in here. It's internal. And in many ways, it is me. The ancient world knew this too, even without Freud's vocabulary. The chaos that Tiamat represents is not just in the sea, it's in the human made from her and her general's blood. And I spent years tracking these monsters and mapping them and naming them and fitting them into a framework, and the framework worked. But every monster I was finding outside of this Mesopotamian tradition was still in some sense out there. It was external. And you could in principle avoid these monsters if you stayed away from the wilderness or the sea, or if you didn't tread carelessly into the throne room, right? You'd be safe from these monsters because they were out there. And it wasn't until I was sort of living inside my own 3.5 years that I finally saw two monsters I'd been circling, but really hadn't just identified them yet. And it hit me. The two most insidious monsters in the Hebrew Bible, and then later in the New Testament, weren't those in the sea or in the wilderness or in the wasteland. They were the ones that these ancient traditions depict as invasive and interior and capable of inhabiting the human self from within. The ones David refers to in his Psalms, Psalm 18. We'll talk about that. The ones Paul in the New Testament couldn't stop writing about. The ones you can't escape by walking away from the ocean or avoiding the wilderness at night, because they were already inside the house. I'm going to talk about one of these today because you need to get out of here on time. The two are death and sin. And I deal with them more fully in the book. And that's the public-facing book, and there will be academic ones coming at some point. But I want to talk about death today, maybe because death is more fascinating to me. I don't know. But death with a capital D. And I want you, to approach these, we have to set aside modern categories about death, right? Mortality, inevitability, biological fact of dying, or not being, the state of not being alive. I'm not talking about that, because that's in there. That's in the biblical text, like that type of categorization of death. But what I'm talking about is death as a character, an agent, a living entity with a will and an appetite and tactics and a throne. And that's the way the Canaanites and the Israelites thinking through, and the Israelites and Judahites producing these writings of the Hebrew Bible imagined death. In the Ugaritic texts, there's a god called Mot. And again, if you're in my Bible class or my Jesus class, we've talked a lot about these at times. Mot, that's the same, the Semitic root for death, the same as the Hebrew Mawat, and Mot in these texts isn't this metaphor. Right? There's metaphor, there's symbolism, there's all this. We could talk about the layers. But in this particular case, he's not just a literary device for the sad reality of mortality. In the ancient mind, Mot is a living being with a body and a domain and an appetite that cannot be satisfied. So in the Baal cycle or Baal cycle, you've read your Bibles, you know about Baal. Mot is described as having a throat that opens as wide as the heavens, with one lip on the heavens and one lip on the earth. And he says, even the gods are going to enter my mouth. And he's threatening individual humans, and he's also threatening the divine world. He's literally threatening the divine order itself. And Baal, the storm god, he's of course the one who brings fertility, whose presence sustains the world. He eventually descends into Mot's gullet. And the text describes it graphically. The Baal goes down into Mot's throat like an olive cake, like the produce of the earth. And in this moment, the life bringer is swallowed by the death god. And as this happens, creation's holding its breath, because the entire survival of the created order relies on Baal to bring rains and fertility and bring life back. And this happens every year, right? This the natural cycles. And so the biblical world, the biblical writers knew these traditions, and the Canaanite and Israelite world weren't sealed apart from each other. But the ancient Israelites did their own theological work with these traditions, right? They didn't just cop them and take them full on, but they reshaped and redirected them. And the grammar, we still find the grammar of death as a devouring, predatory, sovereign figure rather than a mere biological fact, the state of not being alive. We find that in the Hebrew Bible, unmistakably. And when you read these texts closely and you start to see death there as doing a whole lot more than just waiting at life's end. And once you see it, you'll never unsee it. And I want to show you what I mean. The most primal image for death in the Hebrew Bible is its mouth. It's open, it's wide, it's insatiable. Isaiah 5:14 says that Sheol, or death, the the grave or the pit has enlarged its appetite and opened its mouth without measure. The Hebrew describes this vividly as stretched and widened and distended. And it's not describing a static grave. It's describing a creature loosening its jaw so that it can swallow more prey. It can continue devouring. Even it can't be satisfied. The mouth gapes wide enough to engulf not just individuals but entire cities. And the devourer adjusts its jaws to fit whatever meal human corruption provides. Proverbs 27:20, Sheol and Abaddon are never satisfied, a bottomless appetite that doesn't grow full. Defined by hunger. Death is defined by hunger. And then you reach this line in Proverbs 27:20. The proverb immediately compares Sheol's hunger to human desire. And human eyes are never satisfied. The hunger that consumes us mirrors the monster that devours us. And our own insatiable desire for power and for gain, we are already practicing the appetite of the thing that's going to eat us. But death doesn't just wait to devour. It hunts, it pursues, it stalks like a predator. Psalm 18, 4-5. One of the most concentrated texts in the Hebrew Bible that just really gives a portrait of this. The cords of death encompassed me. The torrents of chaos surrounded me, terrified me. The cords of Sheol surrounded me. The snares of death confronted me. So every phrase constricts. The verbs encircled and enveloped, they evoke ropes tightening around it like tentacles. My son is fascinated by octopi right now. So we watch little documentaries on it. And the idea of tentacles wrapping around their prey. The snare, a hidden trap designed to snap shut when stepped on. In the ancient world, this may be more familiar than to the ancients than it is to us today, but everyone knew what it felt like to worry about a hidden trap, a net, a flash flood that in a wadi, a dry wadi that could appear out of nowhere and sweep you away in seconds. And the psalmist reaches for those images because they make visceral, immediate sense. Death isn't a peaceful end, it's an ambush. And death for David in Psalm 18 manifests itself in the hunting and the haunting threats of his life posed by an enemy force on earth. And now if the devouring mouth and the hunting snare portray death as a predator, the next set of images shifts to something even more disquieting, and that's death's sovereignty. Death isn't just an old monster. Death is not just an untamable leviathan stalking the deep that you can avoid if you just don't go in the water. Death is a ruler. Death is a king. Psalm 49:14, and this is a fascinating text, says, like sheep they are appointed for Sheol, death shall be their shepherd. So it's an inversion of Psalm 23, and I think it's on purpose. One of the most beloved Psalms, Psalm 23. You know it even if you don't know it. Depicts God as a shepherd leading his people through the valley of the shadow of death, or Psalm Mawat. But here in Psalm 49, the shepherd is death himself. Death holds the staff. Death guides the flock. Death is the one whose voice the sheep follow. Job 18 gives us another title, the Melech Balachot, the king of terrors. Death is enthroned. Death holds court. The victim is torn from the security of his home. Like you could be safe from Leviathan or Behemoth or the Seraphim or the Ophanim if you stayed home. Not from the king of death, the king of terrors. Death tears the victim from the security of his home and marches him before the king of terrors like a prisoner in chains. Hosea 13:14 gives us death as a warrior, armed, coming for its enemy, addressed directly by the prophet in this particular case as a being that you can taunt. It has ears, it has weapons, those weapons are plagues, and this prophet believes those weapons can be stripped. And you put all this together, and death shepherds like a ruler, judges like a king, invades like a warlord. But at the end of all of this, its rule is illegitimate. God alone is the rightful shepherd, the rightful king, the rightful warrior. Death is a usurper. And this is why the biblical writers speak of death's overthrow, not as just try to stay healthy as long as you can, right? Not in a passive, peaceful way, but as a political act. You don't just survive and avoid death, you revolt against it in the language of resurrection. And the most profound theological claim, and the one that gets closest to the heart of what death actually is in the biblical imagination, is the idea of what I call death as uncreation. Death isn't just the end of life. Death is the unraveling of creation itself. Job 10:21-22 describes the realm toward which he feels himself descending, a land of deep darkness, gloom without order, or lo sadarim, where light is like darkness. Every line in this text is crafted from the vocabulary of Genesis, but it's inverted. Creation begins with God speaking light into darkness. Job describes a place where light has collapsed into darkness again, where the categories upon which creation depends have literally been scrambled. No order, lo sadarim. Not merely chaos, but disintegration. The architecture of creation is collapsing in on itself like light in a black hole. And my physicist student isn't here, but I was going to make sure beforehand. He can't check me on it to make sure I'm getting that right. But Psalm 88, one of the darker psalms in the entire collection, it ends without a resolution. And it asks, do you work wonders for the dead? Do the shades rise up to praise you? Is your steadfast love declared in the grave? And the implied answer, obviously, is no. The realm of death is a theological vacuum, a space where the Creator's attributes can't function. It's counter-creation. It's counter-covenant. It's the place where praise can't rise and chesed can't reach. It's anti-Genesis. It's the great reversal. And that's why it's defeat. Again, it's not the avoidance. It's not passive. It's a revolt against it. And against all of this, the devouring mouth, the hunting snare, the enthroned king, the forces of uncreation, Isaiah 25:8 throws this heavy-handed counterpunch. He will swallow up death forever. This is the moment where the devourer becomes devoured. This is the moment where God turns death's own grammar against it. God does what Baal could never do in the Ugaritic Baal cycle. Baal can restrain Mot, but he can't destroy him. Death continues to resurface every year. His appetite continues to return. You still have to fear him at every moment. For Isaiah, that's not how the story ends. God swallows the swallower. The true shepherd in the ancient mind rescues his flock from the shepherd of death, and the king of creation dethrones the king of terrors. And in this moment, the force of uncreation is itself unmade and unraveled and dismantled. So death, according to the biblical imagination, isn't simply a biological reality. It's not neutral. It's not simply the inevitable state of not being alive. It's a force. It's a sovereign. It's an agent with appetite, with tactics, with an agenda. And for me, maybe for you too, once you've seen it in the text, once you've heard the pit opening its mouth and you've felt the cords of death tightening, you just can't read those texts in the same way again. The ancients who developed these traditions, who named death a devourer, a hunter, a king, a force of uncreation, they weren't doing primitive theology, I don't think. I think they were doing something recognizably human and recognizably serious. I think they were naming things. They were looking around at life, and they were looking at those unnamed, unfaced forces that press against human flourishing, and the ones from the outside, the ones from the inside, and they were refusing to leave them unnamed. They were giving them a face. Because those are harder to survive, at least in my experience, than the named ones. A monster with a name is different from a monster without one. Mot has a name, Maut has a name. The King of Terrors has a title in a court. And that specificity, that insistence on treating these forces as real, as agentive, as describable, I don't see that as ancient superstition. It's the kind of intellectual courage that says chaos is real, the weight is real, the force that seems to be working against you from inside your own body is real. And so I think the ancients insisted that we're not going to explain it away or pretend it's smaller than it is. And what these traditions are doing with these images is what we might call existential naming. They're using the grammar available: mythological, cosmological, theological, historical, ecological, to describe accurately what the human experience of being occupied by forces beyond your control actually feels like. What it feels like when the cords tighten. What it feels like when the shepherd is not the one you trusted. What it feels like when the thing that was supposed to be yours, your will, your own agency, your own thoughts, your own emotions, seems to belong to someone else. And so this is where all of these insights connect back to what I said at the very beginning. The ancient traditions insist that this deified transcendent force, whether it's death, we can talk about it at different times, sin, or these other ones, they're not waiting patiently at the end of life. Its cords are already around us. It's already inside the territory of the self, in the process of aging, in the decay of the body, in the torn hamstring. It just doesn't seem to go away. Having a share in the divine nature, according to these ancient traditions, is not automatically a good thing. The disruptive divine humans carry, according to the Mesopotamian imagination, is woven into us from the blood of Kingu and from the spirit of this rebel deity baked into our clay. And according to the biblical tradition, whose death opens its mouth without measure, and whose cords encircle the body, and whose King of Terrors claims sovereignty over the human creature, is not just the luminous, creative, ordered, and orderly divine. It includes the chaotic, the insurgent, the boundary-defying, or as I would put it, the monstrous, the stuff of monsters is in our veins. I'm not sure how to frame my own personal experience that I've talked about. I don't know if I would frame my own experience the way our ancient predecessors would. But that ancient framework did something for me that my modern categories couldn't quite manage. It named the territory and it said, others have been here. The chaos that I was feeling is real. It's old, and these ancients have been thinking about these experiences a lot longer than I have been around. And so obviously this is not me suggesting a replacement for therapy or medicine or mental or emotional health, okay? And if that's what you've taken from this, we need to spend another couple hours here today, okay? But it's a complement to that. A framework that for me didn't minimize the struggle that I was, this existential struggle that I was going through, but it situated it. It gave it a mythic depth and sort of a historical company. And it insists that the forces that press against human flourishing are real enough to have been named across millennia. And it confirms something I already believed, and I'm almost done, so give me a minute. But I hadn't felt so personally. Again, what we do in biblical studies, religious studies, Judaic studies, the humanities, isn't just academic. The people who read our work and listen to our lectures, if you're still awake, students, thank you, who rely on our findings, they rely on our findings not just for information, but for orientation. To see the traditions with fresh eyes, to see themselves with new lenses. My particular experience, my existential crisis or my midlife crisis, I don't know what to call it. The ancient traditions provided resources for naming these unnamed weights, the chaos without an obvious cause that I had never encountered before. That's our work, and it matters more than we can remember sometimes. when we teach these texts, when we write about them, when we sit with our students, and when or our congregations, or with a reader who picks up our book, or who emails us because something spoke to them, we are doing this work. We're handing someone a name for what they're carrying. It's not small work. It's, in the oldest sense of the word, it's what scholars of these traditions are for. So that's where I am. That's what I've been up to. That's what my book, I, Monster, is about, and the academic versions will be coming out soon. Thank you.